On today's episode of the Locked On Knicks podcast, I'm going to tell you the Knicks' 5 biggest remaining games this season before a deep dive on the Cleveland Cavaliers with Locked On Cavs, Danny Cunningham.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, what's up, guys? I'm Gavin Schall, your Saturday co-host of the Locked On NBA podcast, and of course, your favorite play-by-play broadcaster's favorite play-by-play broadcaster. Today, I'm going to roll solo on Locked On Knicks. No Alex Wolf until I'm joined by Locked On Cavs host Danny Cunningham. But before we get into that, this is Locked On Knicks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, your daily podcast on the New York Knicks, giving you the most detailed insight on your favorite team 5 days a week. And be sure to join thousands of other Knicks fans in subscribing on both YouTube and your favorite podcast platform for the best insight on your favorite team every single day. But if you're a real sicko and that's not enough for you, well, the Locked On Knicks podcast now has a newsletter, the one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. You can sign up for free. I can't emphasize that enough. It is absolutely free at LockedOnDaily.com. That's LockedOnDaily.com, and start your day with the all-new free Locked On Knicks newsletter. You get writing from Alex and I, our team of national writers here at Locked On, and of course, the latest and greatest in fantasy basketball with Josh Lloyd. So on today's show, I'm going to take the first segment to break down the 5 biggest remaining games for the New York Knicks and why they're the 5 biggest remaining games for the New York Knicks over the final third of the season. And then I'm joined, as mentioned, by Danny, who's done a fantastic job taking over as the solo host of the Locked On Cavs podcast this year. I had a bunch of questions for him because I was really intrigued to see if the pressure points the Knicks pushed in that series between the teams 2 years ago are still applicable, or if Cleveland has sort of covered their butts on that, and the Knicks are going to have to find a different way to beat them if they were to hypothetically meet in the playoffs. But before getting into that, as I mentioned, we are going to go through the 5 biggest remaining games. Conveniently, the first one is this Friday at Cleveland, February 21st. The Knicks played the Cavs close in the first matchup of the year. And I think a lot of people forget that because it was a long time ago at this point. It was the third game of the season, way back in October. And that was despite Jalen Brunson having one of, if not his worst game of the season, 21 points. He was 8 of 24 from the field. And if you remember, the Knicks were up by 10 before going ice cold, just kind of forcing the Jalen-centric ISO offense, hero ball, whatever term you want to use. Basically what they defaulted to in the playoffs a year ago is something the Knicks, a trap the Knicks fell into a lot in the early season. And I think this matchup is, I mean, it's so fascinating for a number of reasons that I will leave to the latter portions of this podcast. But one thing I didn't really touch on with Danny is it's interesting to see if the Knicks have evolved from that, right? And they can maximize all 5 guys who are on the floor versus playing a great defense and saying, Jalen, it's on you to bail us out. I kind of thought they had been moving in the right direction, and the wins over the Grizzlies, the Nuggets, the Rockets were all sort of indicative of that. And then you play the Boston Celtics and it against an elite defense and a defense that was capable of taking out or at the very least slowing down Karl-Anthony Towns. The Knicks pivoted back into what I would call their shell offense, which is, hey, Jalen, go. We're going to give you the basketball. We'll set you a screen or we'll clear out. Go make some magic happen against an elite defender. And it's not to say Jalen Brunson can't have success doing that. It is to say that it's unlikely that is going to be enough to beat a team as good as the Cavs, who are the best offense in the NBA, or a team as good as the Boston Celtics. Also worth noting, Evan Mobley, Jared Allen. I talk about them a lot with Danny. I don't think I got to the stat, though. Plus 14.5 per 100 possessions. That is an elite net rating for them as a two-man lineup, 97th percentile offense. So I want to see how the Knicks defend the two of them. They did, again, a pretty good job in that initial matchup between the two teams. My next game is against the Boston Celtics, and I cheated a little. I put both of them on there. Sunday, February 23rd, aka this Sunday, and Tuesday, April 8th. I just need to know before the end of the season the Knicks can be competitive in a game against the Boston Celtics. Maybe this is too low of a bar. I personally feel like I don't even need them to win the game. I just need them to get to the last 2 minutes and have a chance at actually winning the game, because that obviously does not happen when they've lost the first 2 games of the year by a combined 56 points this season. The main thing I'm interested in seeing is Mitchell Robinson, which I don't think we're going to get this Sunday. Hopefully we will get Tuesday, April 8th. And I want to see how the double big lineups hold up, because I've alluded to this a bunch of times, but Minnesota playing Karl-Anthony Towns at power forward held up shockingly well a year ago against the Celtics. And I would imagine Tom Thibodeau and the Knicks staff has been studying that film and figuring out the ways they were able to survive. Sure, Rudy Gobert is a better defender than Mitchell Robinson, but I don't think the gap is as substantial as some people think. And the Knicks also have OG Anunoby, or hopefully will have OG Anunoby, at least for the second matchup. And hopefully he's guarding Jason Tatum from the get-go, unlike the first game where Mikal Bridges got that matchup initially. And the Knicks were trying to use OG off the ball. And of course, the second game, he didn't even get to play. So I want to see how those two hold up. Boston's been so good protecting the rim, best in the NBA, leaning more into those double big lineups. Can the Knicks find some solutions offensively? That is really interesting to me. The next one I have is at the Los Angeles Lakers. That game is Thursday, March 6th. Obviously, it was only about 2.5 weeks ago. The Lakers wrecked the Knicks the last time the two teams met. Attacked Karl-Anthony Towns on both ends of the floor about as well as any team has this side of Boston, ironically enough. And I want to see if the Knicks have answers this time around, particularly defensively. Los Angeles, after trading Anthony Davis for Luka Doncic, is going to lean into small ball, and that is going to inflict a lot of pain on Karl-Anthony Towns and ask him to play in space a whole lot. Personally, I would like to see Tom Thibodeau incorporate some switching. And if that means he's on an island with LeBron, if that means he's on an island with Luka, that is going to cause you some pain. I think that is going to cause you less pain than what we saw last time, which was Cat trying to hedge or just being straight up and drop and giving up open three after open three to Dorian Finney-Smith. Of course, if someone like Rui Hachimura is on the floor, who's a non-shooter, you hide Karl-Anthony Towns there, and then you work with screens as best as you can. Maybe with LeBron, you go under a little bit, see if he's hot to start the game. I don't know how wise that would be, because LeBron has turned himself into a great shooter, and obviously Luka is a very good shooter. So I don't know how many answers the Knicks have in that matchup, and maybe we see what Tom Thibodeau's solution is going to be against the Celtics, and you just lean into Karl-Anthony Towns a little bit less that game, and maybe only play him 28 minutes and play 20 minutes of Precious Achiuwa at center, who can switch everything, particularly when the Lakers don't really have a big on the floor that can punish him. Of course, you're going to have some issues at the rim in that sense, but unless Mitchell Robinson's back for that, which he might be, March 6th, that's a pretty reasonable date. You're going to have rim protection issues anyways. If Mitch is back, I think it totally changes the equation. That I really would probably only play Karl-Anthony Towns something like 28 minutes in that matchup. Of course, contingent on how much he can hurt the Lakers on offense, which last time was not very much. But if you lean into playing both bigs, you might have some issues defending them, especially in the pick and roll and guarding Luka and LeBron, but you should be able to absolutely kill them on the floor, on the boards, because the Lakers do not have an NBA caliber center. My next game against the Milwaukee Bucks, at the Milwaukee Bucks, Friday, March 28th. I'm just really curious to see, because there is a world, the Pistons are only one game behind the Bucks right now. There's a world where that is the first round matchup for the New York Knicks. And if that is the case, I'm really intrigued to see if Kyle Kuzma changes the equation at all for the Bucks, because right now I'm pretty confident in the New York Knicks in that matchup. They have decimated Milwaukee a couple of times this year. The Bucks just have no place to hide Damian Lillard. As we saw last time, they have absolutely no one who had a chance in hell at guarding Jalen Brunson. I wonder if Kuzma is the guy, and if Kuzma is the guy, then where do they put Damian Lillard? Because you should be able to inflict a lot of pain if he's guarding Mikal Bridges. Just you could run screens with Bridges, much like we saw the Knicks do with Trae Young, or you could play it even simpler and just ISO Mikal Bridges on Damian Lillard, particularly down low in the post, and say, "Hey, buddy, go to work." I would expect Milwaukee to heavily cheat off Josh Hart if that is the answer, but the Knicks have ways to weaponize that. So I think that will be a really intriguing chess match there. I do think Kyle Kuzma is going to make Milwaukee better. He's been an elite defensive rebounder for his position pretty consistently throughout his career, and since getting to the Bucks, 100th percentile in defensive rebounding. So that's maybe one area the Knicks can't hurt Milwaukee quite as much. The final game that I am really intrigued by is at Detroit, Thursday, April 10th. As of now, would be the Knicks' first round matchup. And if you've been watching those three games this season, you know that is not a given for the New York Knicks. After blowing Detroit out the first time the two teams met, Detroit has beat them 2 times in a row, with Cade Cunningham and in particular Malik Beasley absolutely torching them. I want to see a full game of OG on Cade. Not that I don't think Mikal did a terrible job last time. I just think Cade has ascended to the point of being worthy of the OG treatment, and if you're Tom Thibodeau, you're okay sacrificing some of what OG gives you off the ball in a weaker matchup to say, hey, we just have to like turn the water off on these guys, and we're gonna throw our rocket at Cade Cunningham. I'm hoping OG is rested enough at that point, and Tom Thibodeau has reduced his minutes enough that we see a 100% version of OG Anunoby, because I don't think he was at full speed defensively in that last matchup against Cade. But I'm really intrigued how OG handles that, because I think that is going to be the defining factor in a Knicks Pistons series, if that is indeed the first round matchup between the two teams. That's another game where I'm kind of curious if the Knicks go double bigs. I think you could potentially hurt Detroit there, as they play a little smaller, obviously, with Isaiah Stewart, who does function well as sort of a small ball five, and Jalen Duren's been playing his best basketball. So I'm fascinated to see how that one turns out. All right, next on Locked On Knicks, we welcome in Danny Cunningham. As promised, I answer some of his questions first. You'll see him introduce me as we flip roles, because technically we were doing this for his podcast initially. And then I'm going to ask him some questions after that. So all that and more is next here on Locked On Knicks. But first, we want to tell you about our good friends over at Prize Picks. Football season may be over, but the basketball action is just heating up, and there's no better way to get on the excitement than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. It's simple. Just pick more or less on 2 or more player projections. And if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. I undersold it. With Prize Picks, you control the action all season long. This week, I'm looking at Jason Tatum in that Sunday game against the New York Knicks, because he absolutely torches them to score more than 29 points. But I will say this, I'm also looking for Jalen Brunson to go out there and get more than 25. What I love about Prize Picks is how quick and easy it is to make picks. It takes less than 60 seconds to set your lineup. Plus, their fast and secure withdrawals mean I get paid in as little as 15 minutes when I win. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNBA for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game.
And welcome back to Locked On Cavs, Mr. Gavin Schall, who does a great job covering the New York Knicks over at Locked On Knicks. The Cavs take on the Knicks for their second game back from the All-Star break. Of course, at one point, I think we all thought this could be a playoff preview, and it still might be. But these two teams, I think, would have to meet in the Eastern Conference Finals, just with the way that the matchups are looking like they will shake out when the playoffs do arrive coming up in a couple of months. But the first half of the season has obviously come and gone for every team at this point, Gavin, as we get ready to start second half of basketball for both the teams we cover tonight. What stands out to you about the first, 54 games that the New York Knicks have played?
I think it is that they are an exceptionally good team, and yet still decisively, I would say, in a playoff context, a small tier below the Cavs. In a regular season context, I would say a pretty substantial tier below the Cavs. And then I think there's another gulf, and I think Oklahoma City and Boston are in their own tier. And I, as both someone who covers the team and as a fan, am caught between the feeling of this is maybe, if not probably, the best Knicks team I've ever witnessed, I've ever covered, as someone like about to turn 30 years old. And simultaneously, there's that disappointment that you give up the 5 first-round picks for Mikal Bridges. You give up of course, the player equity to go get Karl-Anthony Towns. And while this is the first year of, I think, what the Knicks front office feels is going to be a 4 or 5 year run, it is a little disappointing now that you're all in and you see, all right, there are still these teams that feel, I would say, substantially better than the Knicks. So I think it's juggling those two things, that this should be an amazing experience, and Jalen Brunson is maybe the best player in a Knicks uniform I'll ever watch in my lifetime. And also that maybe slight disappointment that, like, there are these teams clearly better than them still.
So what do you view as the things that have gone well for them in terms of integrating Bridges, integrating Towns? Because this is a roster, as you mentioned, that is pretty different from last year. And now we've got a large enough sample size to know what works and what doesn't. What have you liked that you've seen just from the roster as it has grown into what it is now?
Sure. I think the single biggest thing is how quickly Brunson and Towns developed chemistry. That was a process I thought would take 20 to 25 games, because Brunson has, I guess, Kristaps Porzingis a bit during his Mavs career, but of course he wasn't the primary ball handler and never really played with a big as versatile as Towns. And Towns got traded to the Knicks 3 weeks before the season started. So I thought it was going to be a little bit more of a process, and it took about 4 preseason games, and they were on the same page. There are certainly still ways on the margins they can improve, particularly against the best defenses, like, of course, the Cavs in the NBA. But I know I haven't checked the numbers recently, but through the first 30 to 35 games, they were the single best pick and roll combo in basketball. And it still feels like on a night-to-night basis, like one or the other is just going to torch you. And I think that is set the tone for an offense that is the second best in the NBA. I think the other substantial development for the Knicks, and not one that is necessarily contingent on Towns and Bridges, but it is the fact that the bench has been about as good as we could have hoped. And it's ironic because Tom Thibodeau does not play them very much, but Campaign at the minimum has been a revelation. Deuce McBride, after a slow start to the year, has played fairly well. I would say I still think he could play better and play a little bit more, but he has a positive impact every time he's on the court. And Precious Achiuwa, though the Knicks misuse him at times, has certainly been an asset since coming back. And presumably they're going to get even stronger in the second half with Mitchell Robinson coming back, maybe even making his debut against the Cavs.
Right. So we will see if that happens. And you brought up something in terms of Tibbs not necessarily playing everybody, because this is, I think, the starkest contrast between these two teams. And I've got a stat that I'm very curious your reaction. But in the first half of the season, both of these teams, I say half as if they've played 41 teams. No, they both played 54 games. I don't know why we call it first half, second half. I guess it just sounds better than pre-All-Star, post-All-Star. But in the 54 games that the Knicks have played this year, Gavin, they have had 143 instances of a player playing 37 minutes or more in a single game. That was, I think, really on display in that overtime win against Atlanta, the final game that the Knicks played before the All-Star break, when all their starters played at least 42 minutes. The Cavs have had 7 instances this entire season where they have had a player play 37 minutes or more. Do you think that that is something that could catch up with New York ultimately when we get deep into the postseason?
So Tom Thibodeau would tell you the inverse, and he would say that is why my guys are prepared to play heavy minutes in the postseason, and they've been doing that all year long. There might be some merit to it. Personally, I would trend towards your side of things, that I think it will ultimately catch up to them. I mean, there's data that like every extra minute on the court is inherently a little bit more likely you're going to get injured, and that is concern number one for me, that this team will not make it through the season. I thought the narrative last year that the Knicks fell apart because of how Tom Thibodeau played them was actually BS. The Knicks had a far better depth last year. Most players on the team were not playing too many minutes. I don't think the Knicks had anyone, like, in stark contrast to this year, in the top 10, and the injuries were actually kind of fluky. And then once you had the fluky injuries, everyone started playing crazy minutes because you lost that depth. This year, they're just playing all the guys crazy minutes, and the Knicks do not have that depth to survive. Really, even, I would say, one injury to their starting lineup, they should still be able to get out of the first round. I don't really see a world where they beat Boston or Cleveland if even one guy in the starting lineup misses more than a game or two in any specific series. I think they are that reliant, that top heavy on their top 5. So that is a major concern. And I do think, like, throughout the year, like when you see games like the Hawks, I think that is a downwind effect of how many minutes these guys have played, where you see sloppiness defensively, bad decisions in terms of passing the basketball, getting beat backdoor, and guys who are mentally and physically exhausted and making mistakes they normally wouldn't. And that's why, in some sense, the Cavs have been such a dominant regular season team, while the Knicks, in terms of their net rating, have been good, but unremarkable, despite talent that I would say is pretty similar to Cleveland's.
So to your point about last year versus this year for New York, so for the full 82-game regular season last year, the Knicks had 156 instances of 37 or more minutes. And at the All-Star break, they're already at 143. So there is, I think, a big gap. Obviously, they haven't surpassed last year next year, but they could do so as soon as this weekend, depending on how things shake out. You brought up a playoff series against Boston, a playoff series against the Cavs. I think you and I would probably agree it's pretty likely that the Knicks and Celtics are going to see each other in the first round of the playoffs. And just after I see Boston being able to erase a 5.5 game deficit behind the Cavs, and I certainly don't see the Knicks dropping to 4th. So what needs to happen in that playoff setting, Boston, New York, for the Knicks to be able to beat the Celtics 4 times in 7 games?
First of all, I am going to say I think it's extremely unlikely the Knicks will beat the Celtics. They played twice. Boston has won those two games by a combined 56 points, and they've toyed with the Knicks twice now. It is just a particularly poor matchup for the Knicks with how they're constructed, which is not good because they were built to beat the Celtics. So it's a small sample size. The Knicks certainly still have time to figure things out, but because of those minutes you mentioned, we've seen an extraordinary sample size with the Knicks starting lineup. They played close to 300 more minutes than any lineup in the NBA. I think there are only 4 lineups in the league that have played half as many minutes as the Knicks starting lineup. And because of that, I kind of think there's less of a ceiling there than saying like, all right, they still have time to figure this out. But if there was a world where they beat Boston, the single thing they have to figure out is Karl-Anthony Towns on both ends of the floor, unlocking him offensively, protecting him defensively. Boston has just been putting a wing on Jalen Brunson, switching that pick and roll every time, and then doubling Towns when he drives. And due to a combination of the fact that Towns is an elite stationary passer for a big man, he is not a very good drive and kick big like Julius Randle was. And I think that limits his ability when he gets double teamed to say, hey, this guy's open on the opposite wing. I'm going to hit him on a cross court laser like you see a LeBron do, like you see a Luka do. Doesn't totally have that in his game. The other issue for the Knicks in that equation is the loss of Dante DiVincenzo, where they have a bunch of good shooters. They don't have guys that are spaced 5 feet behind the arc and have that quick trigger. And I think against Boston, you absolutely need that with how rangy they are defensively and how well they recover. On the other end of the floor, Boston has just totally victimized him in the pick and roll. And I think that is even a messier option. I think the Knicks should ultimately score the ball pretty well on Boston because they're just that good offensively. They have that level of talent. Defensively, I don't really know how you protect Karl-Anthony Towns. If he's in a drop, Jason Tatum's raining threes. If he's at the level, Tatum's going at him, attacking him off the dribble. Last time they played 2 weeks ago at this point, dunk after dunk after dunk, quick left to right crossover, going downhill. I think maybe the best option for the Knicks that they haven't tried yet is attempting to switch everything. Towns has done a little bit better generally doing that than he has being in drop or being at the level. But I don't know if there's a clean solution. He might just not be a good enough defender, and that might be a weak point that Boston can pick on indefinitely. All right, guys, we're going to wrap this one up with Danny Cunningham. I get to pick his brain and ask him some questions about the Cavs. I'm particularly interested in Evan Mobley and Evan Mobley's three-point shooting because I think that will be the single defining factor in a hypothetical Knicks-Cavs series. But hear it from the expert himself. We talked to Danny about the Cleveland Cavaliers next here on Locked On Knicks. But first, I want to tell you about our friends over at Intuit TurboTax. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you're going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back, guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is taxes. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available at TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. All right, guys, we are back with Danny Cunningham, the fantastic new host of the Locked On Cavs podcast. Danny, thanks for taking the time, man. I am always fascinated with the Cleveland Cavaliers ever since these teams played that playoff series 2 years ago. I've kind of been keeping up with them. It's like, all right, are they gonna keep this team together? Are they gonna blow it up? Like what is the long-term plan in Cleveland? Because I don't want to say I was a hater because I enjoyed watching them. I've been a big Evan Mobley guy since he came in, but I thought there was a capped ceiling on what they could be. And Kenny Atkinson has come in, and this front office has done just an incredible job building out depth to the point where I want to admit I was wrong about that. I did not really see this in Cleveland. So I'm gonna ask you, the expert, and not me, the hater. Do you view Cleveland at this point as a legitimate NBA championship contender?
I absolutely do. And I understand that Oklahoma City is really, really good and Boston is really, really good. And I think that this is a year where the top end of the NBA is probably better than what the top end of the NBA is most years. I mean, you look at what Oklahoma City's net rating is, where they are one of the best teams of all time. Well, the Cavs are actually in that conversation too. They're not at the top of that list the way that the Thunder are, But this is a team whose net rating right now is really similar to what the 73-9 Golden State Warriors were back in 2015-16. So this team is historically good. I think the only reason why they're not maybe thought of as a surefire championship contender, and I do think that there are some people that do, and I put myself in that conversation or in that category, I probably should say, is because we've not seen them do it in the postseason. We haven't seen this group go on a deep postseason run. You brought up that series against the Knicks 2 years ago. They lost in 5 games. Last year, they beat the Orlando Magic in a 7-game just absolute rock fight, and then lose in 5 games to the Boston Celtics in the second round, which I think was the expected outcome. So because they've not done it in the postseason, I don't know that they quite get the respect that they probably merit for how good they have been this regular season. And Kenny Atkinson, I think, deserves a lot of credit, but so does Evan Mobley, who you brought up, because the ceiling for this group, I do think, was a little capped. One, under JB Bickerstaff, because I don't think he had enough offensive creativity, and two, they needed Evan Mobley to take an offensive leap, and that's exactly what he has done. If Evan Mobley is still the guy who he was 2 years ago on offense, I don't think the Cavs are nearly this good, and I don't think things between him and Jarrett Allen work out in terms of being able to have both of them on the floor at the same time. But the Cavs have figured that out and been one of the best offenses, not just in the NBA, where they've been number one overall basically all season long, but they've been one of the best offenses of all time this year. And I think Evan Mobley deserves a lot of credit for it. I think Kenny Atkinson deserves a lot of credit for it. And because of that, I absolutely think that they're a team that's capable of hoisting the Larry O'Brien trophy in the middle of June.
So you got a little ahead of me there. That's exactly where I was headed next. I might, if I were to describe my admittedly, if someone who doesn't watch this team every night, outdated view of the Cavs, and where I had doubts, and where I think I still maybe not rightfully have some lingering confidence if the Knicks and Cavs meet in the playoff series, it came down to 2 things. One, like again, thinking back to that series 2 years ago, the Cavs not having that 5th spot identified, because that was the ongoing issue in that series. You had put Isaac Okoro out there. Great. You can guard Jalen Brunson. You don't have the spacing offensively that you need. You flip it to Karis LeVert. It was the inverse issue. And I don't think he was necessarily, maybe this changed. Obviously he's out the door now, so it doesn't matter, but I didn't think he was the cleanest fit next to Garland or Mitchell, given the priorities in his game. And then the other thing was Evan Mobley shooting and like the Knicks' ability to shrink the floor against the Cavs. And given now that they have DeAndre Hunter in there, I think Mobley's shot from distance, and if he is treated like a capital S shooter in the postseason, or if teams come playoff time are saying, hey, Evan Mobley, we dare you to take 10 threes. We are just not going to guard you out there. I'm curious how you think those double big lineups work in the playoffs. I did a soft dive into the stats. I saw he's taking twice as many threes as he ever has at any point in his career, still less than 3 a game, hitting 37%, the same as last year. What was most intriguing to me, though, is that he shot 52% in 5 games in October, 52% in December, which is obviously incredible. But then outside of that, the other 3 months of the season, or 2.5 months of the season, halfway through February, he's been under 31%. So it seems like there's some real high highs, some real low lows. Do you buy Evan Mobley as a volume 3-point shooter in the playoffs, or do you disagree with my premise that that's needed for the Cavs to maintain their offensive production relative to the rest of the league this postseason?
So I do think it's needed. I also don't think he's ever going to turn into Karl-Anthony Towns, where you want him taking 10 threes a game. I think the sweet spot for him is probably around 4 or 5 is where the Cavs would like him to be in terms of just his volume of attempts from beyond the arc. And as far as the percentages go, he's certainly had some hot streaks, but some of the colder streaks that he's been on have been related to injuries too, because he had an ankle injury that he was working his way back from in early January. And that's when I think you started to see him slip a little bit. And then he had a calf injury at the end of January. And I think that's why his numbers before the All-Star break from beyond the 3-point line have been down, because I just think he's still working his way back and not quite back to the 100% mark that we're used to seeing him at. So I do attribute some of the slippage in terms of shooting percentage to that. It's also interesting because he didn't start off this season as a volume 3-point shooter. Through really the end of November, he was still kind of taking right around his career average of under 2 a game. And then he had a game in Charlotte where he went, I believe, 6 of 8 from 3 from beyond the arc. And from that point forward, his volume is about where the Cavs would like it to be. And then the injuries kind of started playing a little bit of a factor. And I think he started shooting less from outside, in part because of that. I do think it's something that is necessary, but I also think that there are just so many good shooters on this Cavs team in a way that there weren't even last year or 2 years ago, because Darius Garland is back to being an all-star version of Darius Garland. Obviously, he's having a great year, shooting right around 43% from beyond the arc. Donovan Mitchell, we know what he's capable of. Dean Wade, when he's healthy, is a very good shooter. Isaac Okoro, before he hurt his shoulder injury in early December, was shooting like 48% from beyond the arc. So this is a team, and then you add in DeAndre Hunter too, who's obviously a really good shooter as well. So this is a team that they're not overly reliant on Mobley, but I also don't think that they can maximize who they can be offensively without him doing at least a little bit of everything.
All right, tell me a little bit about the early returns of DeAndre Hunter. I think as we're recording this, has only played 3 games for the Cavs, but that was this side of Luka Doncic, the pre-trade deadline move that kind of rattled me a little bit, where I was like, God damn, that is a perfect fit for what I feel like the Cavs need in a hypothetical series against the Knicks. It means there was really no hiding spot for Jalen Brunson, which I think is significant, because that was also one of the areas where I'm like, all right, the Knicks might have an edge, because there's really nowhere to put Darius Garland defensively. Maybe there's a spot you could plug Jalen Brunson. It's not too painful for the Knicks. I do think, even though it's not totally DeAndre Hunter's game, that is a matchup he could hypothetically take advantage of. And just the added size, I think, is going to be so significant for Cleveland, both against the Knicks and hypothetically against the Boston Celtics, if that is the Eastern Conference Finals. But what have you thought about him so far, and how do you think he raises Cleveland's ceiling?
So I think he's a perfect fit for everything this Cavs team needed, because I mentioned Dean Wade in my previous answer about the shooting, and Dean has been really good for the Cavs when he's been available. But the knock on Wade is that he's often injured, and he's missed a bunch of time with a couple of different injuries so far this season. But if you look up and down the roster, they've got the 2 bigs. They've got Jared Allen and Evan Mobley. Those guys are around 7 feet. They've got 2 great guards in Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell. And then they have a bunch of wings who are kind of undersized in between, where you look at Max Strus, who's around 6'5". Isaac Okoro is certainly one of the stronger wings in the league, but he's only 6'4". Sam Merrill, not a big guy. You've got Dean Wade, who is 6'8", 6'9", and that was kind of it. So adding DeAndre Hunter there, I think, just gives them much needed depth on that wing. Offensively, I think, as you mentioned, it gives them another avenue to attack defenses, but I just don't think that end of the floor for the Cavs needed all that much help with how good they've been. What I think this does is, defensively, the length that he brings, it gives the Cavs, and we've not seen this yet because of the injuries I've mentioned, but it gives the Cavs and Kenny Atkinson the ability to really throw out some what could be nightmare type of lineups for opponents to try and score on, because they could have a lineup where you've got one of Garland or Mitchell, and then you've got Max Strus, DeAndre Hunter, Dean Wade, and then Evan Mobley or Jarrett Allen. And that's going to be something that is incredibly difficult for opponents to score on. I think he's a guy with his length, with his wingspan, that really shrinks the floor for opponents. And that is exactly what the Cavs needed. The one thing that I'm going to keep watching from really the time he first played, so go back a couple weeks at this point to his first game in Cleveland against Minnesota last Monday. But what is the Cavs defensive rating from that point forward? Like, that is a number that I look at and say, okay, this is what matters here, because they were a good defense before they acquired Hunter, but now I think they should be great. And if they are, I think that's going to translate really well to the postseason.
I think there is a level of lineup versatility Kenny Atkinson has at his disposal, and just like a deep toolbox. Like whatever the question is, it feels like he can find an answer on his roster. It's on him to deploy it correctly. It's on the guys to make plays. Last thing, because it seems like Cleveland has all the answers right now. What is your biggest lingering concern about this team in a playoff context of them being a legitimate title contender?
Can they limit how many 3-pointers the Boston Celtics shoot? I think that is the thing that is going to decide whether or not they win the Eastern Conference. And then if they get to the finals, who knows what happens in a series against potentially OKC or Denver or whoever wins the West. I don't want to look that far ahead, but I do think that the conference finals, and this is no shade to your New York Knicks, but I do think the conference finals are probably going to be Cleveland and Boston. I like the matchups for the Cavs to get to the conference finals. I like the matchups for Boston a little bit less, having to go through New York. I don't think the Cavs are going to have to go through a team quite as good as the Knicks before they see Boston or New York. But ultimately, if they can limit how many 3-pointers the Boston Celtics shoot, they will, I think, find success in that series, because both those teams, I think, are great. I think both of those teams are worthy of winning the NBA championship. But if they can get Boston away from playing their offensive brand of basketball and start getting them to play an isolation-focused brand where maybe it's Jason Tatum taking a bunch of 18-footers and he's going to make them because he's really, really good, but you would rather him taking those shots and living with the results rather than them taking 55 three-pointers a game, making 22 of them, and then you have a serious math problem no matter how good you are offensively.
I think the Knicks have a very similar approach, and we saw it last time they played the Celtics, being comfortable switching Jalen Brunson onto Jason Tatum. And my understanding is the Cavs have done similar things with Darius Garland to try to almost influence Boston into those shots. I think it's a good idea. We'll see if it works out for either of them. Maybe best case scenario, Danny, we'll be talking conference finals in a few months. But until then, he's Danny Cunningham. I'm Gavin Schall. Locked On Knicks, Locked On Cavs. We'll talk to you soon on our respective pods.